The air inside the Crimson Palace's VIP vault was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the suffocating weight of desperation. Under the flicker of gold-plated chandeliers, Ricardo Vega leaned forward, sliding a leather folder across the green felt like a death warrant. Inside lay the Alexander contract, a $750 million debt that transformed a human life into a line item. Across the room, Sophia Alexander moved like a ghost in sequins, her platinum blonde hair catching the light as she served drinks to the very men currently bidding on her future. She was the grand prize, a woman being sold by her own blood to pay for a gambling addiction she didn't share. The room held its breath as the price climbed into the stratosphere, but the bidding war died a sudden, violent death when a voice like grinding gravel cut through the greed. Kyle Johnson, the devil of the Southwest, stepped out of the shadows, his charcoal suit as sharp as the cold intent in his eyes. He didn't just join the game, he ended it. With a single, calculated royal flush, he staked a fortune to claim the contract. The room braced for a display of dark ownership, expecting the most dangerous man in Vegas to drag his new prize into the night. Instead, Kyle stood before a trembling Sophia and did the unthinkable. In a slow, deliberate motion, he shredded the $750 million document, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like ash. He didn't want a slave, he was settling a debt for a night 2 years ago when she had saved his life with nothing but bar napkins and mercy. He gave her the one thing no one in that room could buy, her freedom. But as Sophia stared at the man who had just thrown away a king's ransom for her, she realized that being set free by the devil was just the beginning of a much more dangerous game. The cards fell like destiny across the green felt table, each one sealing a fate that had been set in motion 2 years before. Kyle Johnson didn't blink as he pushed the mountain of chips forward, $750 million in a single, audacious move that made even the most hardened gamblers in the Crimson Palace VIP room catch their breath. The casino owner, Ricardo Vega, sat across from him with that debt contract clutched in his sweating hands like a winning lottery ticket, his smile already counting the fortune he'd extract from America's most dangerous crime boss. But Kyle wasn't looking at Vega. His dark eyes tracked the woman moving between tables with practiced invisibility, her gold hoop earrings catching the light as she served drinks to men who never really saw her. Sophia Alexander had perfected the art of being present but not present, there but not there, a survival skill for women who worked in places where powerful men played games with other people's lives. Royal flush, Kyle said quietly, laying down his cards with the calm of a man who'd already won before the game began. The room erupted in chaos. Gasps, curses, the scrape of chairs as people stood to witness the impossible. Vega's face went the color of old concrete as he stared at the cards, then at the chips, then at the contract he'd have to surrender. Kyle stood, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket with methodical precision, and walked directly to where Sophia had frozen mid-step, a tray trembling in her hands. He took the contract from Vega's nerveless fingers without breaking eye contact with her. Those dark eyes that had haunted his dreams for 2 years, wide now with confusion and something that looked like terror. She thought he was claiming her. Everyone in the room thought he was claiming her. Kyle tore the contract in half. Then in half again. And again, until confetti pieces of her 3-year prison sentence floated to the casino floor like snow. "You're free," he said in accented English that carried the weight of absolute authority. "You don't owe anyone anything anymore." Sophia stared at him, her lips parted, and Kyle saw the exact moment recognition flickered across her beautiful face. The stranger with the bullet wounds. The man she'd hidden in the supply room, whose blood she'd staunched with bar towels and medical tape while a cartel death squad searched the casino. The man she'd saved without knowing she was saving herself. "I don't understand," she whispered. Kyle pulled a business card from his inner pocket and pressed it into her hand, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary against her palm. "You saved my life once. Now we're even." He turned to leave, nodding to Marcus who materialized from the shadows like a ghost in an expensive suit. "Watch over her," Kyle said in Spanish, low enough that only his most trusted associate could hear. From a distance. "My world is far too dangerous for someone like her." Marcus nodded once, his scarred face impassive, and Kyle walked out of the Crimson Palace casino knowing he'd just made the most expensive and most foolish investment of his criminal career, betting everything that setting her free would somehow, eventually, bring her back to him. Freedom tasted like possibility. For the first week after Kyle Johnson tore up her contract, Sophia walked through Las Vegas like a woman learning to breathe again. She'd enrolled in the Las Vegas Culinary Institute using money she'd hidden from the casino's garnishments over 3 years, small bills tucked into the lining of her grandmother's old jewelry box, a secret fund for a dream she'd almost stopped believing in. Her abuela's recipes, the ones written in fading Spanish on grease-stained index cards, would finally become something more than nostalgia. She was chopping onions in the Institute's practice kitchen, her eyes watering but her heart lighter than it had been in years, when Miguel walked through the door. Her brother had that look, the one she'd learned to recognize in childhood. Desperate eyes, fidgeting hands, the false brightness of a man standing on the edge of a cliff trying to convince everyone he could fly. "Hermana," he said, and the word that should have meant love felt like a noose. "How did you find me?" Sophia's knife stilled against the cutting board. "I'm your brother. I'll always find you." Miguel glanced around the kitchen, his gaze calculating the value of everything he saw. "Look, I need your help. It's bad this time, sophomore, really bad. $400,000. That's what Miguel owed to the Sinaloa pipeline, men who didn't negotiate, didn't forgive, didn't care that addiction was a disease instead of a choice. He'd gambled away money that wasn't his, made promises he couldn't keep, and now the bill had come due in blood or cash. "I can't help you," Sophia said quietly, her hands trembling as she set down the knife. "Miguel, I just got free. I can't go back to that." Something ugly flickered across her brother's face. "You think you're better than me now? That mafia boss tore up your contract and suddenly you're too good for your own family? That's not what You know what I think?" Miguel leaned closer, and Sophia smelled the desperation on him like cheap cologne. "I think a man doesn't spend $750 million on a casino waitress unless she's worth something. I think Kyle Johnson's property is worth at least $2 million to the right buyer." The words hit like a physical blow. "Miguel, no. Don't." But her brother was already backing toward the door, his face a mask of self-justification and survival instinct. "I have to think of myself first, Sophia. You'd do the same if you were in my position." He was gone before she could scream. Across the street, in a black SUV with tinted windows, Marcus watched Miguel Alexander make 3 phone calls in rapid succession. The first to a number linked to a human trafficking ring operating between Mexico and Vegas. The second to confirm a meeting location. The third to negotiate a price for information about Kyle Johnson's investment. Marcus pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed. When Kyle answered, Marcus spoke in rapid Spanish. "We have a problem. The brother just sold her out." "Then make sure," Kyle said, his voice cold as a grave, "that the problem is contained before it reaches her." The coffee tasted bitter, but Sophia drank it anyway because Miguel had bought it for her, a peace offering after their argument at the Culinary Institute. They sat in her tiny studio apartment, the one she'd rented with her first free paycheck, and her brother wore his apologetic face like a mask that didn't quite fit. "I'm sorry, sophomore. I was desperate, said things I didn't mean." He pushed the cup closer to her with trembling fingers. "Just drink your coffee and let me explain the plan. I found a way out of this mess." The room tilted sideways before she could ask what plan. Sophia's vision blurred, her limbs suddenly heavy as concrete, and she watched through dimming consciousness as Miguel caught her falling body with hands that shook but didn't hesitate. "I have to think of myself first," he whispered, and those were the last words she heard before the darkness took her. She woke to the sound of gunfire. The world came back in fractured pieces, the metallic smell of blood, the weight of zip ties cutting into her wrists, voices shouting in rapid Spanish about merchandise and delivery schedules. Sophia was in the back of a van, and through the cracked rear doors she could see muzzle flashes lighting up the Vegas night like deadly fireworks. Then Kyle Johnson appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel dressed in Armani, his gun raised and his face a mask of cold fury that made the devil himself look merciful. "Touch her again," he said in a voice that promised graves, "and I'll make sure you die slowly." The traffickers were professionals who'd moved human cargo across borders for decades. They died like amateurs, cut down by Kyle's security team with the efficiency of men who'd done this 1,000 times before. Marcus appeared beside Kyle, cutting Sophia's restraints with a tactical knife while Kyle kept his weapon trained on the last man standing, Miguel, cowering behind a shipping crate with his hands raised. "Please, Mr. Johnson, I can explain." Kyle shot him in the kneecap. Miguel's scream echoed off the warehouse walls, and Sophia watched her brother collapse, wondering when she'd stopped feeling anything for him but disgust. "Get her out of here," Kyle ordered Marcus, but Sophia found her voice even as her rescuer tried to guide her toward the exit. "Who are you?" Kyle holstered his weapon and met her eyes across the blood-stained concrete. "Kyle Johnson. Head of the Johnson Crime Syndicate. Arms trafficking, money laundering, political corruption, everything your nightmares are made of." He stepped closer, and Sophia saw something almost like regret in those dark eyes. "You should stay away from me, Sophia. We're from different worlds. You just saved my life. And I'll do it again if I have to." Kyle turned away, his voice dropping to something that sounded like defeat. "But that doesn't mean you belong in mine." He left her standing in that warehouse with Marcus and a dozen bodies and the ruins of her brother's betrayal scattered across the floor. But what Sophia didn't know, what Kyle would never tell her, was that before dawn broke over Vegas, armed guards had been positioned on her grandmother's street, gang activity in her neighborhood had been systematically eliminated, and every person who'd ever looked at Sophia Alexander as a commodity had received a very clear message written in blood and fear. Kyle Johnson might have walked away, but he'd never stopped protecting her. He'd simply learned to do it from the shadows where monsters belonged. The house on Mariposa Street had belonged to Sophia's family for 3 generations, a small stucco home with her abuela's rose garden and the kitchen where every important moment of Sophia's life had been measured in the smell of fresh tortillas and simmering mole. Miguel gambled it away on a Tuesday, signing papers he had no legal right to sign, forging their grandmother's signature with the same hands that had once been blessed at her baptism. The enforcers came on Friday. Sophia was helping her grandmother prepare tamales when the banging started, fists on the door hard enough to rattle the Virgin Mary portrait on the wall. 3 men in cheap suits with expensive guns, holding foreclosure papers and wearing smiles that promised violence. The lead enforcer, a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, looked Sophia up and down like merchandise he was appraising. "You've got an hour to pack," he said. Then his gaze slid to her grandmother, barely 5 feet tall and 73 years old, who stood in her kitchen doorway with a wooden spoon clutched like a weapon. "Or we can work out alternative payment arrangements." He reached for her abuela's arm, and Sophia moved without thinking, putting her body between the enforcer and the woman who'd raised her. The backhand caught her across the face hard enough to split her lip, and she tasted copper and rage in equal measure. The enforcer never got the chance to hit her again. Kyle Johnson came through the door with the force of a natural disaster, Marcus and 6 armed men flanking him like the wrath of God made manifest in tailored suits. The lead enforcer managed to draw his weapon before Kyle's security team had guns pressed to the heads of all 3 intruders with the precision of men who'd choreographed this dance 100 times before. "You're in my city," Kyle said quietly, his accent making the words sound like a death sentence, threatening what's mine. "That's poor judgment. We didn't know she was." "Leave." Kyle's voice dropped to something barely human. "If I see you again, I'll send you home in pieces small enough to mail." They ran, leaving the foreclosure papers scattered across her grandmother's clean floor like contamination. Kyle turned to Sophia, his expression softening as he took in her bleeding lip and the trembling hands she tried to hide. Behind him, her abuela was crossing herself and whispering prayers in rapid Spanish. "I can't escape this, can I?" Sophia said, and it wasn't really a question. "Your enemies, everyone who knows about the casino, about the contract, they've made me a target." "Yes." The honesty shouldn't have been comforting, but somehow it was. Sophia wiped blood from her mouth and met his eyes. "Then teach me. I have a business degree, organizational skills, I'm fluent in English and Spanish. Teach me to survive in your world, and I'll make myself useful." Kyle studied her for a long moment, and Sophia saw him war with himself, the part that wanted to protect her from his darkness fighting the part that recognized she was already drowning in it. Finally, he nodded. "Pack what matters," he said. "Both of you. You're coming with me." The compound was a fortress disguised as a mansion in the hills outside Vegas, with armed guards and surveillance systems and walls high enough to keep the monsters out, or keep them in. Kyle's world smelled like gun oil and expensive whiskey and the kind of money that came with blood on it. That night, he taught Sophia how to hold a Glock 19, his hand steady over hers as he adjusted her grip. "In my world," Kyle said softly, "mercy gets you killed." Sophia pulled the trigger, the recoil singing through her bones, and wondered when she'd stopped being the woman who saved lives and started becoming the woman who'd learned to take them. The charity gala at the Bellagio was the kind of event where Vegas's criminal elite dressed up in designer gowns and tuxedos to pretend they were legitimate, donations laundered through non-profit foundations while champagne flowed like absolution. Kyle had insisted Sophia attend as his guest, dressing her in a midnight blue gown that cost more than her grandmother's house and draping diamonds around her throat like declarations of war. Isabella Moretti made her entrance like a queen arriving at a rebellion, all ice blonde hair and old Italian money, the kind of woman who'd been raised believing the world owed her everything simply for existing. She crossed the ballroom with predatory grace, her entourage of socialites trailing behind like pilot fish following a shark. "So you're the charity case," Isabella said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence that fell over their section of the room. "The little spick whore who thinks she can play in our world." Sophia's champagne glass trembled in her hand, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just a guest, like everyone else." "A guest?" Isabella's laugh was cruel crystal. "You're Kyle Johnson's rebound toy. A waitress he picked up like a stray dog." She stepped closer, her perfume expensive and suffocating. "Let's show everyone what you really are, shall we? What you were before you spread your legs for a crime boss." Isabella's hands moved fast, grabbing at Sophia's dress, nails raking across expensive fabric as she tried to tear it away, to expose her in front of Vegas's most powerful families. "Illegal trash," Isabella hissed, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "You don't belong here. You'll never be one of us." Sophia fought back, but Isabella had help, two of her friends grabbing Sophia's arms while cameras flashed and security mysteriously remained absent. The dress tore at the shoulder, and Sophia felt the humiliation burn through her like acid, the old shame of being judged, being less than, being reduced to her body and her heritage by people who'd never had to fight for anything. Then Kyle was there. He moved through the crowd like violence contained in a suit, his face a mask of fury so absolute that grown men stepped back without thinking. He caught Isabella's wrist mid-strike with enough force to make her gasp, and when he spoke, his voice carried the promise of apocalypse. "She is mine," Kyle said, pulling Sophia against him with his free arm while still holding Isabella in a grip that would leave bruises. "My partner. My equal. And if you ever touch her again, Isabella, I will erase your family from existence." He released the Moretti heiress with enough force to send her stumbling back into her friends. Then Kyle removed his jacket and draped it over Sophia's shoulders, covering the torn dress with a tenderness that made her throat tight. "We're leaving," he said softly, "just for her. And I'm going to burn their world down." He kept his promise. Over the next 72 hours, Sophia watched from Kyle's war room as he systematically destroyed the Moretti family's operations with the precision of a surgeon removing a cancer. Gambling houses raided by federal agents who'd suddenly received anonymous tips. Money laundering schemes exposed through leaked financial documents. Political allies who'd taken Moretti bribes suddenly facing corruption charges. Business partners who mysteriously discovered they had better options elsewhere. Kyle made calls in 3 languages, moved money through offshore accounts, and activated networks of informants and corrupt officials with the casual efficiency of a man who owned the system. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. Sophia stood beside him as he worked, understanding for the first time the terrifying scope of his power. This wasn't just a crime boss. This was an empire built on fear and favors and the absolute certainty that crossing Kyle Johnson meant losing everything you'd ever loved. "Is this what you do?" she asked quietly as another Moretti property burned on the news feed. When someone threatens what's yours? Kyle turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the flames on the screen. This is what I do when someone threatens you, Sophia. There's a difference. And somehow, surrounded by the ruins of his enemies, Sophia felt safer than she ever had in her life. The whispers started in Kyle's own organization, carried through the compound like poison in the ventilation system. Sophia heard them in fragments, overheard conversations that died when she entered rooms, pitying looks from household staff who thought she didn't notice, Marcus's carefully neutral expression when Kyle left her alone in meetings with his lieutenants. She looks like Elena, doesn't she? Same coloring, same height. The boss has been different since his sister died. Maybe he just needed someone to fill that void. Poor girl probably doesn't even realize she's a replacement. The words burrowed under Sophia's skin like splinters, infected and festering. She'd fallen in love with Kyle Johnson, the man who'd freed her, protected her, taught her to be strong in a world that wanted to break her. But what if she was just a ghost he dressed in expensive clothes? What if every time he looked at her, he saw the sister he'd failed to save? She found him in his office at midnight, surrounded by surveillance monitors and encrypted communications, running an empire that never slept. Kyle looked up when she entered, and the smile that crossed his face felt like a knife twisting in her chest because what if that smile was never really for her? Am I her? Sophia's voice cracked on the question. Am I Elena to you? A replacement for what you lost? Kyle went very still, the kind of stillness that came before violence or revelation. He stood slowly, moving around his desk with measured steps, and Sophia saw something in his eyes that looked like pain mixed with understanding. Tell me the truth, she whispered. Please. You want the truth? Kyle's accent thickened with emotion. 2 years ago, I walked into the Crimson Palace casino to meet with the Sinaloa cartel's lieutenant. It was supposed to be a negotiation. It was an ambush. He touched his side, where Sophia knew scars mapped the story of bullets and survival. I was bleeding out, running through that casino while sicarios hunted me, and I thought I was going to die there. Then a cocktail waitress I'd never spoken to grabbed my arm and pulled me into a supply room. Sophia's breath caught. She remembered that night, the terrified man with the expensive suit covered in blood, the way his dark eyes had pleaded with her not to call security, how her hands had shaken as she'd wrapped bar towels around his wounds. You didn't know who I was, Kyle continued, stepping closer. You could have turned me in, collected a reward from the cartel. Instead, you risked everything to save a stranger. You used medical tape and vodka from the bar to clean my wounds. You stayed with me for 3 hours while your boss threatened to fire you for disappearing. You gave me your jacket to cover the blood when I finally left. He cupped her face in his hands, and Sophia felt tears she didn't know she'd been crying. I spent 2 years trying to find you. I bought the casino, paid off your contract, spent $750 million, not because you remind me of Elena. Because you're the reason I'm still alive. You're the woman who showed mercy to a monster and made him remember what it felt like to be human. Kyle. You were never a replacement, mi amor. You were always the one. The kiss tasted like truth and salt and promises that felt too big to break. When they finally pulled apart, Kyle pressed his forehead against hers and spoke in Spanish, words her grandmother had taught her about love that endures, about souls that recognize each other across lifetimes. After that night, Kyle stopped hiding what Sophia meant to him. He hired chefs who could recreate her abuela's mole recipe, learned Spanish phrases that made her grandmother laugh with delight, attended Sunday Mass at the little church in her old neighborhood with armed guards disguised as parishioners. He bought her a restaurant space in downtown Vegas and told her to name it after her grandmother. He loved her not despite her heritage, but because of everything she was, Mexican-American, survivor, the woman who'd saved him when he'd forgotten how to save himself. The farmer's market on Saturday mornings had become Sophia's ritual with her grandmother, a slice of normalcy in a world run by men with guns and blood money. They walked through stalls of fresh produce and handmade tamales, her abuela haggling in rapid Spanish with vendors who remembered when this neighborhood was theirs before the casinos swallowed everything. Marcus and 2 other guards trailed them at a discreet distance, shadows Kyle insisted on even for grocery shopping. Sophia was laughing at something her grandmother said about the overpriced cilantro when the black SUV rounded the corner, its windows already rolling down. Everything slowed to nightmare frames. Marcus shouting. The first crack of gunfire. Sophia's grandmother pushing her down with surprising strength for a woman of 73, her small body covering Sophia's as bullets tore through the morning air like angry hornets seeking flesh. The shooting lasted maybe 15 seconds. It felt like hours. When the silence came, weighted and terrible, Sophia found herself covered in blood that wasn't hers. Her grandmother lay still in her arms, her eyes already distant, and the last words she whispered were in Spanish, something about love and protection and making sure Sophia lived the life she'd dreamed of. She died there on the cracked asphalt between the fruit stand and the flower vendor, surrounded by scattered oranges and the ruins of an ordinary Saturday. Kyle arrived before the ambulances, his helicopter landing in the middle of the street with the audacity of a man who owned the city and everyone in it. He knelt beside Sophia in her grandmother's blood and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. He just held her while she screamed and sobbed and broke into pieces that felt too sharp to ever fit back together. The funeral was traditional, a full Catholic mass at the church where her grandmother had prayed every Sunday for 50 years, mariachi musicians playing songs about going home to God, and so many flowers that the sanctuary looked like a garden. Kyle stood beside Sophia in a black suit, his hand never leaving hers, and when the priest spoke about eternal rest, she felt Kyle's fingers tighten as if he too was holding on against the pull of grief. He'd paid for everything. More than that, he'd understood what her grandmother would have wanted, the old hymns in Spanish, the long procession through her old neighborhood, the wake with food from recipes her abuela had taught to cousins and friends. Kyle helped serve tamales to mourners, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up as he moved through the crowd with quiet respect. That night, alone in their bedroom at the compound, Sophia finally broke completely. Kyle held her while she cried until there was nothing left, and somewhere in those dark hours she felt him crying too, for her loss, but also for his own. For Elena, the sister he couldn't save. For all the people their world had destroyed. Isabella and Derek did this, Kyle said quietly against her hair. They've formed an alliance. This was meant to kill you, to hurt me through you. Your grandmother was, his voice cracked. She was collateral damage in their war against me. I know. Sophia pulled back to look at him through swollen eyes. And I want them dead, Kyle. I want everyone who took her from me to pay. 2 weeks later, Sophia discovered she was pregnant. The test sat on the bathroom counter like a grenade with the pin pulled, 2 pink lines that changed everything. She was going to bring a child into Kyle Johnson's world, a world where grandmothers died in crossfire and love made you a target. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something fiercer ignite in her chest. When she told Kyle, he went very still, his hand moving to her stomach with a reverence that looked like worship. A baby, he whispered. Our baby. Derek will use this, Sophia said, because she'd learned to think like them now, to see threats in every shadow. He'll see the pregnancy as leverage. Let him try. Kyle's voice turned cold. I'll bury anyone who comes near you or our child. He proposed that same night with a diamond ring so massive it should have been obscene but somehow wasn't, a declaration that she was his and he was hers and nothing in heaven or hell would separate them. They planned an engagement party for the following month at the Crimson Palace Casino, the place where everything had started. It felt like tempting fate, celebrating in the same glittering cage where she'd once been trapped. But Sophia was done being afraid. She'd survived her brother's betrayal, Isabella's rage, and the loss of her grandmother. She was carrying Kyle Johnson's heir and wearing his ring. If Derek and Isabella wanted war, she'd give them one. But first, she'd have one perfect night where she got to be happy despite the monsters circling outside. The Crimson Palace Casino had been transformed into something from a fever dream, millions of dollars in crystal chandeliers and white roses, champagne flowing like promises, and Vegas's criminal elite dressed in their finest to celebrate the engagement of Kyle Johnson and the woman who'd somehow tamed him. Sophia wore a white gown that cost more than most people's houses, her hand resting protectively over the small curve of her stomach where their daughter grew, and for one shining moment she let herself believe they could have this love and happiness despite the blood-soaked foundation it was built on. Miguel appeared during the toast, stumbling through security with the desperate confidence of a man who'd already decided to burn every bridge. $5 million, he announced loud enough to silence the room. That's what I want for family compensation. For giving up my sister to you people. Kyle's security moved to remove him, but Sophia held up her hand. She needed to see this, needed to witness her brother's final betrayal so she could finally let him go. Miguel, leave. Please. You owe me. Miguel's voice cracked with entitlement and addiction. I'm your brother, your blood, and you just. The first gunshot came from the east entrance. Isabella Moretti and a dozen hired guns, all wearing expressions that promised murder and vindication. Miguel went down in the crossfire, clutching his stomach as he finally understood that in this world, even blood couldn't save you. The ballroom exploded into chaos, guests screaming, security returning fire, champagne glasses shattering like ice under the percussion of automatic weapons. Kyle pulled Sophia behind an overturned table, his body a shield while Marcus and his team engaged Isabella's assault force with the brutal efficiency of men who trained for exactly this scenario. Then the lights went out. In the darkness and confusion, hands grabbed Sophia, professional, quick, dragging her through a service exit before Kyle could react. She fought, using every technique he'd taught her, but there were too many of them. The last thing she heard was Kyle screaming her name like a prayer that went unanswered. She woke in a warehouse that smelled like rust and old blood, zip-tied to a chair with a video camera pointed at her face. Derek Johnson stood in the frame, his resemblance to Kyle twisted into something uglier by jealousy and ambition. "Hello, brother," he said into the camera. "Let's talk about what happens to your little spick whore and her bastard if you don't surrender everything." The video call connected, and Sophia saw Kyle on the screen, surrounded by his men, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "Derek, let her go. This is between us. Surrender the organization, or watch her lose that baby. Your choice." Derek pulled out a syringe filled with something that made Sophia's blood run cold. "I've got a doctor on standby. We can make this very unpleasant." Kyle's jaw clenched. "I'll meet you. Alone. But you let her go first. You don't negotiate with me." Derek backhanded Sophia hard enough to split her lip, and on the screen she saw Kyle flinch like he'd been the one hit. "You show up at the coordinates I send, unarmed, or I start cutting pieces off her until you comply." The warehouse where they'd told Kyle to come was rigged with cameras so Sophia could watch every moment. He walked in alone as promised, his hands raised, and Derek shot him before he could speak, 3 times in the chest, the bullets blooming red across his white shirt like fatal flowers. Sophia screamed through the gag they'd put on her, watching Kyle collapse while Derek stood over him with a gun trained on his head. "Say goodbye to Daddy, little heir." But Kyle had taught her more than just how to hold a gun. He'd taught her to think, to wait for the moment when men underestimated her. The guard nearest to her had relaxed, distracted by the execution playing out in front of them. Sophia grabbed his sidearm with bound hands, twisted despite the zip ties cutting into her wrists, and put 3 rounds in his chest the way Kyle had shown her at the range. She shot the second guard before he could draw. The third tried to run. She shot him in the back. Derek turned at the sound of gunfire, his eyes wide with something that looked like respect mixing with terror, and Sophia pulled the trigger one more time. Her brother-in-law collapsed beside Kyle's bleeding body, and Sophia was running, cutting her bonds on a piece of broken glass, calling for help in a voice that came out more animal than human. Kyle survived the surgery through sheer will and 5 hours of doctors rebuilding organs that should have been beyond repair. But the blood loss, the trauma, his body shut down into a coma that no one could promise he'd wake from. By morning, the Moretti family had been systematically eliminated in retaliation, their empire burning while Kyle Johnson slept. 2 years had passed since the explosion at the docks, and the woman who once danced for tips in a neon-lit cage had vanished, replaced by a silhouette of obsidian silk and cold iron. Sophia was no longer just the woman Kyle Rander had saved, she was La Reina, the sovereign of the Rander Empire. In the silence of Kyle's ongoing coma, she had not merely maintained his legacy, she had perfected it. She purged the disloyal, streamlined the street operations into high-tech security firms, and turned her grandmother's humble recipes into a Michelin-starred restaurant empire that served as the world's most elegant laundering machine. In the center of her glass-walled office, Sophia looked down at their daughter, Elena, who shared Kyle's piercing eyes and her own stubborn resolve. Sophia had learned that power wasn't just about the gun in her thigh holster, it was about the strategic ruthlessness required to keep her family safe. She had traded her innocence for a crown of thorns, and she wore it with a terrifying grace. The peace of the afternoon was shattered by the screech of tires and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the compound's gravel. The Valdez cartel had arrived. Dozens of armed men formed a predatory circle around the estate, led by Marco Valdez, a man who saw Sophia's widowhood as an acquisition opportunity. He strode into the foyer, his voice dripping with condescending arrogance. He offered her an ultimatum: marry him to merge their empires, or watch as his men reduced her world to ash. "You're a beautiful woman, Sophia, but a woman cannot hold a throne forever," Marco sneered, reaching out to touch the heavy gold ring on her finger. "Let me take the weight of this crown off your head." Sophia didn't flinch. She stared him down with a gaze that had frozen more seasoned killers than him. "This crown isn't heavy, Marco. It's part of me." Just as the tension reached a breaking point and the cartel's fingers tightened on their triggers, a low, rasping sound echoed from the monitors of the medical wing, a sound that had been absent for 730 days. The heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase creaked open. There stood Kyle Rander. He was leaner, his skin pale from the long sleep, but the lethal predatory stillness in his stance was unmistakable. He held a custom-made .45, his hands steady as a mountain. "Get your hands off my queen," Kyle's voice was a ghost's growl, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The room erupted. Sophia didn't wait for him to lead, she drew her own weapon in a synchronized blur of motion. Side by side, they fought with a terrifying symmetry, the king and the queen defending their daughter and their empire. In the aftermath of the smoke and the fallen, Kyle looked at Sophia, seeing the strategic brilliance in her eyes and the blood on her silk sleeve. He realized then that he had never bought her freedom at that casino, he had simply unlocked the cage of a lioness. She was never the damsel he needed to save. She was his equal, his partner, and together, they were an unstoppable force that the world would never dare to challenge again.